Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to be here, and let me share my screen, and then we will work through that and hope that all goes well. Right, hopefully everyone can see that and I can move on. So yes, Helen and I today, we're going to talk about our book, a little bit about our book, introduce our book, Women Remembered, Jesus' Female Disciples. And you should know that it started off as a television documentary. Let me just try and move this forward. It's sticking already. Oh, here we go. Here we go.
Oh, hooray.
So we began well, it was, I don't know when exactly we began. We cooked up this documentary ourselves, which is really unusual in the world of television, because very often we have been asked to participate in documentaries, and it's always somebody else's idea. The television company will come to us and say, hey, we've got an idea of doing this documentary. We would like you to participate, usually as what they call a talking head, where you're just, as we are now, they just interview you and they cut little bits of what you say into their documentary. You will have seen it Timeless Times. Sometimes they've flown us out in locations and we've wandered around ruins and talked about things. But we thought, well, surely we can come up with an idea for a documentary that we find really important. And we did this and created a pitch and sent it to a television documentary making company called Minerva Media. So we thought we wanted to do something about women. We wanted to do something that really explored what the story is of the earliest Christian women, the disciples of Jesus particularly, and why we don't have them mainstreamed in terms of our texts. We were originally going to call it Lost Women, but then we thought maybe it sounded a little bit like they were wandering around lost and couldn't find their way. And we talked it all through with a producer director called Jean-Claude Bragard, who used to work for the BBC. He used to head the religion service of the BBC and then went independent. And he put us together also with producer director Anna Cox, who was part of the Minerva team. And we, from our pitch, then built up this television documentary that Jean-Claude then himself pitched to different companies, all these different funding companies, including the National Geographic. And it was quite a long time for him to really take this pitch around and try and get them interested. And then finally, Channel 4 in the UK picked it up and funded it, and then they could go into production. So that's the background for the television part of our story. And I'll hand over to Helen and hopefully move on the slides for the next bit.
Thank you, Joan. I'm trusting you just to turn on the slides when seems appropriate. So thank you to everyone at FutureChurch too for inviting me along. It's great to be here. So yeah, a snip here of us making the documentary. In all, we had about 2 weeks in Israel. And if anyone has ever made a documentary or had anything to do with anything like this, you'll know that there is a huge amount of sitting around. Most of what we did was sit around or doing things multiple times. And the documentary itself was only 45 minutes in the end. And we had so much material. It only focused as well on 4 women. And, there was so much more that we wanted to get out. So what we started to do actually was to keep a little note of ideas. And we thought, even at the time, we thought, wouldn't it be great to put together a book? Originally, we thought maybe a book to go with the TV series, but obviously you have to be quite organized and get it out quickly. So in the end, we really like this idea of a book, and any downtime we had, we would get out the laptop and just think, and this is one of my favorite photos from the documentary, us driving around. We spent so much time driving, and I let Joan do all the driving because I'm not used to a left-hand drive. We drive on the other side of the road in Britain. So so I did let Joan do all of that. I just sat there, and we joked about ourselves being like Thelma and Louise or Cagney and Lacey or something like that. Intrepid biblical scholars going around Israel. But we kept all these ideas, and then when we got back, we put them together in a book, and that's really the origins of what we have here.
Thank you. Yes, and we had some key questions for the documentary makers, and also for the book. We were thinking, you know, who were Jesus' female disciples? And when we were brainstorming, we named all of them that we could think of, we could remember, but we're also aware that there were unnamed women disciples as well, and just think about what people remembered about them and why they wrote things down, and we were aware also that there are a very wide range of early Christian sources. So while we might be channeled to think of the Gospels as prior to everything, and of course they're really important, we can look outside the Gospels, we can look within the New Testament to the Acts of the Apostles, we can look to the letters of Paul, and we can look to extra canonical material as well, the writings of the so-called church fathers, I don't know, the church parents, and also art. And looking at all of these different sources, the key thing is to identify what people remembered, what they chose to remember, and then decided to write down. So the method, the fundamental method that we have founded ourselves on is basically the method of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and many of you will know that she wrote this extremely important book in memory of her in the 1980s, and then it's been reprinted and updated many times, and a whole host of other books. I mean, she's the real star. She's just amazing what she did in terms of working out strategies of interpretation. So you don't just read the text and think that it tells you everything you need to know. You have to, in order to really think about what the women disciples of Jesus were about, what they were doing, we have to reconstruct them using careful hermeneutical strategies. And at one place she talks about a dance of hermeneutics. You move through these different ways of trying to tease things out of a text rather than assuming it tells you everything. For those of you that have never hit the word hermeneutics, it means interpretation. So everything we do in terms of reading an ancient text, we're interpreting it as we're reading it. So how do we get to the women? Well, one of the things she says is, you know, you have to approach the text, the ancient texts we've got in our Bibles and in early Christian literature, with a hermeneutic of suspicion. And that sounds a bit sort of very suspicious, you know, worried. But in a way, what it is a hermeneutics of awareness. You have to recognize that these texts are written in a patriarchal ancient context. Even if the people who are writing them are trying to create a more egalitarian vision, they're in this world in which patriarchy is normative. And if you've done any unconscious bias training, you'll know that if you belong to a particular milieu where things are normal in a particular way, you just absorb certain things, and you might prioritize what men do because they're the most important people in the world. There were all sorts of reasons why texts were written the way they were. You can't just read out this text and think that it's a window to an ancient actuality. You have to think about what she calls rhetoric, the way things were put together, the way things were presented. So in order to get to the historical reality, you sometimes have to read against the grain of this rhetoric, this way things are constructed to persuade us of certain things. And sometimes that means looking for slippages in the texts, seeing where little bits of information can open up a different reality than the dominant one that is they are trying to present. And she also suggests a hermeneutic of creative actualization, where it's okay to use imaginative strategies when it comes to the people who are on the margins of what is really wanting to be presented in terms of the rhetoric. So when it comes to women, marginal groups, slaves, and so on, using creativity and trying to imagine their lives from what we know of their context is okay. It's not a no-no. And so we have very much engaged with that. And Helen and I, we had our imaginative moments where we would sit. I particularly remember a scene when we were filming in the theatre in Tiberias, thinking about Joanna, and we just imagined her life. We just brainstormed. We sat there and brainstormed. And in fact, this is the most wonderful thing of working with a partner on writing this work, because we could just bounce off each other and think and brainstorm and imagine.
So we take it as a given that the text is what's known as androcentric. And I think it's good to have an example of this. So the text is focusing on the men. And this passage here in Acts 1, right at the beginning of the book of Acts, the story of Pentecost, I think is a good example. So if you read the black stuff, and when they entered the city, they went up into the upper room where they were staying, namely Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Jude, son of James. These all were persisting with one accord in the activity of prayer. All good manly men there. And then the author just says, oh, with women, wives, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers, sisters. They're just kind of added on, the bit in red there. And the word for women is also wives, is the same word. And also the word for brothers and sisters is the same, adelphoi there. It can have a female version, but Greek is one of these gendered languages. So if you have a group of people that's male and female, you'll use a masculine ending. So that's what you've got there, adelphoi. And older versions would have just translated that as Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers, because adelphoi is masculine. But one of the things that you need to do, and this is what Fiorenza is getting at about, really delving in and looking at the language, adelphoi could also include women as well. So brothers and sisters is fine as a translation there. And the text goes on, and in those days, Peter standing up in the middle of the adelphoi. So again, older versions would have just said brothers, but we know that there were women in these crowds. So it's fine to translate it as brothers and sisters. There were a crowd of named ones there, about 120 people, men and brothers and sisters. So again, I think that gives you some insight into how the text is very much focusing on the men. It's naming the men. Women are just added as an afterthought, and everything about this text is really tracking the men, shining a light on the men, and letting the women just be there in the background. So androcentrism, just sort of briefly, is very much the male gaze. It's the man looking at other men, treating women as light relief. Oh, the ladies have come on, it must be tea time. Women are very much at the margins of all of this and shining the spotlight very much on the men. And there's a concern, of course, in all of this to preserve the status and importance of the men, to keep the men as the center of the movement. We're looking at the men. And why is this? Well, partly it's simply because that's how society is. But there's another very good reason. On the next slide. And here it is. Yes, thank you. We know that one of the things that opponents of Christianity had against the new movement was that there were too many women in it. And one of the earliest opponents is a philosopher called Celsus, who wrote around about 170 CE. We've actually lost the works of Celsus himself, but they are preserved largely by the church father Origen, who wrote in the 2nd century, and he preserves large chunks of Celsus. So one of the things that we know that Celsus said is this little snippet here. Do you think that that the ending of your tragedy is to be thought of as noble and convincing, that while alive, Jesus was no help to himself, but dead, he rose and showed the signs of his punishment and how his hands were pierced? Who saw this? A delirious woman, as you say. So the earliest witness to the resurrection was, of course, Mary Magdalene. And so Celsus just thinks this is ridiculous. You know, you're founding your faith on the word of a delirious woman. Celsus also charges Christianity with being a religion full of women and beggars and the lowest life of society. So there's this idea in the ancient world that if a religion has too many women, it's dangerous. It's somehow a danger to the social order. So quite apart from the fact that I think the men just naturally wrote about what men were doing, there was also a kind of a hidden agenda that they knew that to include too much about what the women were doing was a bad thing and could play into the hands of opponents. And so all of these reasons, I think, kind of conspired to keeping quiet about the contribution of women.
Thank you. That this slide is stuck, so I'm pressing the key. It will eventually.
Too much technology. It all seemed like a good idea, didn't it? When we said, let's have a slide.
Yeah, nothing is happening. If I press it harder, it was starting to stick already.
Yes.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. Sometimes if this happens, it goes marching forward to 2 or 3 slides, but it's not. Okay. So as Helen said, there's this focus on what the men were about. And we've got this presentation of the 12, as we saw in that piece from the Acts of the Apostles, then presented as 12 named men sent as envoys. So Jesus creates this group of apostles or envoys sent out in his name, and there they are, named men. And it's all very solid male stuff. But if we're thinking about slippages, one of the things in Mark that is curious is that Mark says that the 12 were sent out on their mission around Galilee 2 by 2. And actually 2 by 2 is a very striking term in Greek. Door actually reflects this language of Noah's Ark. The animals went in 2 by 2. And the question is whether or not the 12 as named men did in fact have female partners. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul asks, in fact, if he and Barnabas have a right to a sister wife in their mission, like the male apostles and the brothers of the Lord. So it creates an idea that actually in Galilee or elsewhere, there were teams. There was a male and female with the men named. So the distinctive team might be under the name of the men as a rule, but I think, we think probably not always. But this is where the women have been masked. The women have just not had the light shone on them. And there's this little slippage that indicates that there was a female reality to Jesus' movement in Galilee. And one thing that it's important to remember is that we need to distinguish between these envoys, these apostles, and the wider group of disciples of Jesus in Galilee. We're interested in that wider group particularly. And from that wider group, the apostles were chosen by Jesus to have this particular envoy representative role. But it might actually be the 12 as in, you know, a model of the 12 tribes, the model of a team, 12 teams of 2. Matthew, however, the Gospel of Matthew presents the 12 as the definitive disciples. Matthew talks about the 12 disciples. So all of the other people who are disciples in Mark and Luke and John become a little bit vaguer, and they can be seen as sort of camp followers. They just sort of follow Jesus around, but not as definitive disciples. Matthew was really homed in on the 12 disciples as the 12 apostles. And that also is a strategy of creating a sense that there is continuity between Jesus and, you know, this bunch of 12 men who are going to take his message forward. And this is all very, very reliable. Okay, so we need to move on. But for the wider group of disciples, what is really fascinating is at the end of the Gospel of Mark, Mark says, in regard to Jesus' crucifixion, there were women also looking from a distance, among whom were also Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Little and Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they also followed him and served or ministered to him. And there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And this is the most amazing thing. This is a real indication that there were women involved in the movement in Galilee, and they were serving, ministering to him. Well, this is the language of ministry. This is, you know, serving Christ is what ministers do. And that they were his disciples. They followed him like the other named male disciples. When Jesus calls them, he says, "Follow me," as a way of calling them to discipleship. So this is a very, very important statement that indicates that we should reimagine the whole story that we've just had in Mark with women in every room, really, that we go into in terms of the narrative of Mark. And yet it's so interesting that it's only at this point that Mark has decided to shine the light on the women. And the reason why is because the men had all run away. It was only the women that actually remained. And their witness was absolutely vital for what would come next. So all the Gospels recognize really that the testimony of women is at this point absolutely fundamental. In Matthew and John, the women then at the empty tomb see Jesus and is directly commissioned by Jesus as messengers of the truth of the resurrection. So even though the gospel writers might want to push back against the likes of Celsus and say, you know, there's lots of reliable men here, when it comes to the absolutely fundamental truths that will found the faith in terms of Jesus' resurrection, it rests on the testimony of women.
Of course, there are many, many women throughout the Gospels. Mark leaves mentioning the women to right at the end, as we've seen. But when Luke retells Mark's story, he puts the women back where they should be, right at the very beginning of the story, or at least in chapter 8. He mentions other women. The only woman, I think, who's in both lists is Mary Magdalene. He adds the detail that 7 demons had been driven out of her. He also mentions a woman that Joan has referred to already, Joanna, the wife of Chusa. She's presumably a woman of some status. The wife of Chusa is Herod's steward, probably has really quite a prestigious job up in Herod's palace in Tiberias. So she is a woman of some standing, some status, perhaps connections. And Susanna and many others about whom we know nothing at all. So Luke mentions them early on. So that does not allow us to change our mental image of it's no longer Jesus and the 12 men, possibly with one woman, Mary Magdalene. Now it's a range of women who've come with him from Galilee and are on the road with him. And Luke adds the intriguing detail that these women were serving or ministering. It's the same word here, the Greek word from which we get deacon. They were deaconing to him out of their own resources. So the phraseology here suggests financial resources. So that's quite an intriguing detail. These women are not just there for the ride. They are women of some status who've got some kind of money, and they're using it to help out the movement. Has it stuck again, Joan? Yeah. I think we're going to go on to Acts. Is that right? I think the next slide is to do with Acts. Acts also gives us the names of many women who continue the ministry after the resurrection of Jesus. Aha, there they are. This is just a few of them. Tabitha, Mary, the mother of John Mark, who of course opens up her house in Jerusalem for the new movement. There's the daughters of Philip, who are female prophets. There's Lydia, and one of my favorites, there's Priscilla or Prisca and her husband Aquila. What's really interesting about them is that Priscilla is named often before her husband Aquila, and that's very unusual in the ancient world, whereas we wouldn't think anything particularly about it nowadays. It was very unusual to mention a woman first in the first century, and that suggests that she's perhaps of more prominence within the Christian community than her husband. And certainly we know from Acts that she seems to be the one who takes the lead in educating this extremely learned man from Alexandria called Apollos. So Prisca is there in Acts, but she's also referred to in Paul's letters. Romans 16, I love Romans 16. I mean, the letter of the Romans has got so much theology, but the last chapter is the one for me that's got all the social history. And that's what I like about it. It's got this long list of people that Paul is greeting in Rome. Top of the list is Phoebe, who seems to be taking Paul's letter to Rome. So she's not only taking the letter, she's presumably reading it out and interpreting it for the Romans. So the first interpreter of Paul was a woman, a very trusted woman, clearly. Paul mentions Prisca and Aquila, who are there in Rome already. They're preparing the Roman church for Paul. Junia, he mentions, and of the whole list of people that he greets, a third of them are women. So that really is very interesting, because it's kind of like a snapshot. Paul is not trying to show his diversity credentials, quite the opposite. He's just saying hello to people he knows. And the fact that a third of them are women, and women are described as deacons, they're carrying letters, they're leaders of house churches, they're disciples, they're apostles, they're in all of these major roles. 1 Corinthians 2, where we're told about the community being led by the Spirit and spiritual gifts, Paul there talks about women prophesying in the church. He's got no problem with women prophesying. He just wants them to cover their heads whilst they're doing it. And this is summed up to some extent in Galatians 3:28, this really famous passage, which some have seen as part of perhaps a baptism, words spoken at baptism, where Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ." So this is a community then where men and women are both serving in what seems to be fairly equal measures. And I think it's really important that we don't think in terms of leadership roles in the first century and the early church as being ordained. It's nothing to do with the kind of ordination and very strict ideas of various ecclesiastical roles that we have nowadays. This is all much more charismatic. And importantly, the early Christians are expecting the end of the world. They think they're not going to be around for very long. Watch, wait, the imminent breaking in of God and God's kingdom is all the kind of things that Paul is talking about. And this kind of millenarian movement is very much the kind of social arrangement where women do quite frequently have very similar roles to men. So God is going to break in soon. All world hierarchies and social systems will be swept away, and women's work in the mission is just as important as the men's.
Yeah, so we have looked at literature. We have tried to tease out what we can find from reading literature with different strategies of reading. We can also look at ancient Christian art, and this is something that has been explored by a number of people now, and is increasingly recognized as a source of information in itself. And as Helen said, with this the spirit-led type of leadership in the early church, what we see time and time again in early Christian art is this figure of a woman standing up and praying and apparently being listened to. There's also a whole history of how this art is being interpreted, that the woman is often considered symbolic, sometimes symbolic of the church. So if you've got a strong woman in a leadership position, the scholars will say, oh, it's just a symbol of the church. And there are scholars who are trying to work out what is going on in some of these images, and also how things have changed in the early Christian centuries about how women are being presented. And most foremost of these scholars is Ali Katias, who we met in our documentary, and she has a couple of key spots in our documentary because she's so important. And I recommend that you go to her website and see the sort of work that she's doing on early Christian material to read this and try and understand what it's telling us about women. She says the interpretation of early Christian art has been done through the male gaze, and that, you know, it's mainly men who've been interpreting it, and they've been reading what they want to read and see what they expect to see. And in fact, especially in Rome, the church authorities have controlled the interpretation of catacomb art. So there's still a lot of work to be done to really look at it afresh. But what is clear is that women feature in a lot of it, and have active roles in all sorts of different ways. And she's got a lot of fantastic examples, and we don't have time to review all of them, but just to show one of them, is an ivory reliquary box showing what she says is old St. Peter's in Rome, and the liturgy that was being enacted in old St. Peter's, where you can see men and women around the altar in this panel. And there are different sides of the church. There's a gender segregation in terms of women on one side and men on the other. The men are on the left side in this picture and the women on the right side of this picture, but they join together in the middle. And there's a bit of a close-up there where both a man and a woman are holding the cup over the altar in the church. And she says this kind of representation shouldn't lead you to any kind of interpretation other really than that there is a real place for women in liturgical functions at the front of the church, leading worship. They've all got their arms up in prayer, and they're speaking, and this is truly telling us what actually took place in terms of church services. And we have to be careful about the literature, because the literature was copied and copied and copied, and could be edited at any point, and what was chosen in terms of what was being copied has had a strong patriarchal androcentric dimension. So this art isn't altered, it's just as it is. Some art actually is altered. Ali also has indications of how women have been erased, there we go, with mosaics redone, so that new mosaics will actually obliterate women, but in this case not. Yes, and all sorts of other examples too. We went to Rome, and this is one of the sarcophagi Helen can talk about that we saw.
Yeah, we know that we've just been listing all of these women who are clearly playing major roles, important roles in the Jesus movement and the early church through Paul and beyond. But then something seems to go wrong for women after having this sort of glorious early period. By about the early 4th century, things have changed quite dramatically. And one of the ways we can see this is also by art. And this is one of Ali Catius's examples too. This is a sarcophagus from the 3rd century in Rome. It tells the story of Jonah, but it's also got, Jonah was very frequently linked with funerals, but it's also got the story of the raising of Lazarus, which again is commonly linked with funerals. And if you look at the picture of poor little Lazarus, is the little guy on the left who's all bandaged up. But Jesus is there in the middle with Mary and Martha on either side of him. One of them you can see quite clearly here is kneeling, the other one's standing up. But they're the same size as Jesus in this, as you'd expect. They're all human beings. That's quite normal. But if we get to later pictures, and I hope we can get the slide up because we need the slide for this. Is it not working, Joan? Well, I'll start to describe it and hopefully we'll get the slide up as I do it. As we go on to later 4th, 5th century reproductions of the story of Lazarus, a very curious thing happens to Mary and Martha. They start to shrink. And they become really small until by the 5th century, they're like little tiny toadstools. They're hardly recognizable as human. So it's like the artist, here we are. The one on the left, we have this very strangely sort of formed female who looks more like a sort of a dog or something or a lion on the left. And then if you look at the picture on the right, she's right on the left-hand side of the picture. And she looks like a little, I don't know, a hedgehog or something. She's very peculiar. It's like the author still thought or the artist thought, we have to keep them in, but we'll make them as tiny as possible. So there we have, in very, very graphic terms, a story of how normal-sized women just become kind of shrunken in the story. They're just about there, but hardly at all. So what's going on here? Well, a large part of it, I think, is because the early church, as we already said, was expecting an imminent end. They thought the world wasn't going to last very long. The second coming was just around the corner. But then, of course, it didn't come. And the church realized that it had to adapt. It had to be there for the long haul. And so it started to fit in with society, to accommodate to the gender norms of the Greco-Roman world about it. And so they wanted to not draw attention to themselves. And the best way to do that was to ape the formalities of the world around them. So men became bishops and elders, and women had to know their place and to dress modestly and to confine themselves to the domestic sphere. It also seems to be that the kind of Christianity that Constantine favored when he became a Christian was a much more sort of male military type of Christianity, because there's all kinds of forms of Christianity at this point. This is well before creeds and councils, but they, of course, the councils and creeds started up in the late, in the 4th century, really, and that's where a lot of the early Christian standardization started to occur. And of course, it's in the context of this much more male way of doing it. It's also the time of our best New Testament manuscripts. Joan's already mentioned that texts could be changed. The texts seem to have been quite fluid, actually, in the earlier period. But once you start to get these big codexes, as they're called, or book-like collections of the whole of the New Testament material, then the chances of changing it actually become slimmer, and it's written the kind of the variants that people decide are most likely to be the accurate ones tend to be the much more male focused ones. But of course, despite all of that, there's still stories of women's resistance, women's defiance, whole communities that continued to have female leadership. In some ways, you only need to try to push women down if the opposite is actually the reality. And one of the great highlights of the documentary that we made was meeting this woman here. She's a picture, she's been restored a bit, but this is what she would have looked like originally. And her name is Chirulla. She's from the catacombs in Naples. And we know that she was a 6th century Christian bishop. And we know she was a bishop because of the iconography that you can see there, the open gospels with tongues of fire coming out of them, and the costume that she's wearing. So I think it's really interesting that Naples is not that far away from Rome, which was quickly becoming the central part of the Christian story. So even in Italy itself, you have communities that are led by a woman and clearly cherish her memory after her death. So that's a good point to end, I think.
Thank you. Oh, that was wonderful. Oh my gosh. So we're going to spend a little bit of time letting people ask questions. Please keep your questions really short and to the point so that we can get anybody in who wants to ask a question. So if you use the little reaction sign to hold your hand up, or if you can't figure that out, if you put your hand up, hopefully I could see you. But anyway, so go ahead and we'll open up the let's see here. We'll open things up for people to ask questions. Okay, let's see. We have Ann Harrington. Will you ask your question, Ann?
Yes. When one of the slides, the woman had the kind of shawl on her head in the art. How did you know that was a woman? It didn't look real clear to me.
Women wear long garments, and at the time, the men have short tunics down to their knees, but a woman's tunic is long. A man would only wear a long tunic, a long robe, if he was very wealthy, or a king, or this was the style. Roman togas for wealthy Roman men were very huge, but that's not what's being depicted here. It's a regular tunic. So you can tell the woman by the length of her hem.
Well, that clears it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So Mary Raymond, you have a question?
In the depiction you had of the the shrunken woman, I thought it looked like there was a figure on the floor that was, like at a person at the figure's feet, at the larger figure's feet, on the left side, down on the bottom.
Yeah, I think that was the figure that we were drawing attention to. That was Mary or Martha, the tiny. She's so shrunken that she barely looks human anymore.
All right, I thought you were talking, when you were talking about Mary, it was the actual what looked like a carved figure or that was there in that little cove or alcove or something.
No, that's Lazarus. He stays small all the time. Thank you. Can we get
I'm sorry that I misunderstood.
Yeah, see, Lazarus is very small, and that is a bit curious in its own way as well.
Okay.
But in the earlier, the 3rd century picture, Mary and Martha are completely normal, life-sized. Here there's a beautiful picture here on the lower one to the right. You can see Mary or Martha there falling at his feet, and Mary or Martha seems to be the other woman behind Jesus's arm, and they're the same size as Jesus and the disciples. But when you get to these later ones, and it's curious, you've got 2 sarcophagi here, both of which have shrunken the women. So again, it seems to be some kind of pictorial sign that they're just not really as important to the story.
They're also veiled. What happens is that
Yeah.
there's a veiling of women through the 4th century. It's quite a good way of dating art, because to start off with, women are not veiled in Christian art, but during the 4th century they become more and more veiled, and by the 5th century they're very much veiled and end up wearing what we would think of as a hijab, which is called a maphorian. For centuries, that was what Christian women wore, and it actually influenced Islam. That's another story.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for the question. Rita, you have a question?
Hi, I'm over here with Diane. So thank you, Joan and Helen. It was just fabulous and delightful to hear you, and I love the examples. One observation I wanted to make, well, actually two, is what you call slippages, which were really interesting. Carla Ricci calls revealing traces and hidden presence in her book, Mary Magdalene and the many others. And you've added to the examples she has, so I'm going to add to my summary of that book. Thank you so much. The other thing is at the end of Corinthians, that 9:5 example you gave, I think Paul actually says Peter and somebody else are lucky because they have a believing wife with them. So it's not just a wife, but a believing wife. And I know, I just think that's really a powerful image. And so I just wanted to add that, and thank you for this fantastic work.
That's a good thing to point out. Actually, it's all about translation. You know, we've got to be on top of the actual text. There's also translation. In the text, it just says sister wife, Adelphi, you know. So it's one of these things that people then interpret sister as meaning believing. And as Helen said before, the term for wife, gune, is also woman. So it's a sister woman, how are you going to translate that? And you can look up online all the different ways, different Bibles translate that. But certainly, yes, believing wife is one of the ways it has been translated. But it could actually be not a regular marriage, actually, that they have these understandings in the early church of a sort of spiritual marriage, a spiritual partnership for missions or for living together. Jerome in the 4th century thought it was very problematic because all sorts of things could go wrong, but they were celibate unions.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's very revealing. Thanks.
So Bonnie, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Just let me do that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I muted. Okay, I thought I unmuted. Yeah, it was very interesting in all the research you did, and especially I think in the artwork, because we know what's in the Gospels. Is Mary, the mother of Jesus, shown in any other role other than mother of Jesus, that is sweet, loving, you know, caring mother? Does she show up at all as a disciple type of person?
I don't think she does she, Joan? I mean, the only, I guess, unless there's anything on Acts, you know, the Pentecost story where she's already there in the upper room, but all the traditional roles are all very maternal, even the ones that link her with the goddess Isis and that very sort of maternal way of sitting there with a child on her lap. But you're our art person, Joan.
Well, I think it's a tricky one to say whether or not she was counted among the disciples as such. Yes, her role is very much as a mother, but she is in Acts 2 in the room where the Spirit comes and therefore participates in that experience, though she's already portrayed as a prophet in Luke. In the nativity stories, she has extraordinary experiences of meeting the angel and speaks as a prophet. So she, in a way, she has a higher status than as a disciple in Luke Acts.
Thank you. And thank you for all that work and the wonderful presentation you've done. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So Margaret, you have a question, and then we're going to take Rosalind, and that'll be it for the hour. So Margaret, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'll try to make this as quick as I can. I too appreciate so much seeing these images in art. I appreciate art, but my knowledge of it is very weak. My question is, when you show the diminishment of the women through the age into such forms that, as you recall, or as you spoke, are almost like a hedgehog, is there a similar occurrence of that kind of diminishment in other art? You see that elsewhere, where a figure that was represented more normally at one point becomes so diminished later. Does that make sense to you? Is there a parallel to that?
Ali Catius would be the person to ask that question. But it's very striking that the male disciples still remain the same size.
Yes.
Peter and John and the others depicted are still the same size as Jesus. It's the women, Mary, Martha, that
yes,
they get changed in terms of their size.
Yes,
It
it's
makes
just
me
so
think of-
striking, and I just wondered if that historically means something, if that matched, other kind of representatives art of that time period, where figures that had previously been, seen as normal, were became diminished. Did that mean particularly anything at that time? But I appreciate that the right person isn't here to answer. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes me think too of the sort of Egyptian art, where the size indicates status,
Okay.
and not so much that people are changing, but if someone were to change, then it would suggest a change in their status. And so I think it's sort of fairly well established that size can say something about how important you are on a sarcophagus or something like that. But I mean, the intriguing thing here is the change, and I don't know. Yeah, we'd have to ask Ali, but I'm not aware of anything else where people are changing size
I
like
see.
that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. And Rosalind?
Thank you so much for your scholarship, both of you. Since the pretext for this whole conversation is that there's a whole lot more that happened than made it into the canon, what is your educated position on whether Jesus might in fact have been married to Mary Magdalene?
Yeah, I think that's such a big question. It's difficult to answer in a few in a short response. There's no evidence, there's no hard evidence in all of early Christian literature that he was married to Mary Magdalene, but there's a lot of evidence that she was the foremost female disciple, and she's given a great deal of space in terms of Gnostic literature. She turns up as Jesus' foremost disciples there. Some of the things that have been interpreted as indicating a romantic relationship, for example, in the Gospel of Philip, where the other disciples are jealous of Mary Magdalene because Jesus kisses her more than them and loves her more than them. It actually implies a family environment where all the disciples expect to be brothers and sisters together, and Jesus is sort of showing favoritism to Mary Magdalene, but Peter and the others want to be in the same position as her. So it doesn't imply, oh well, of course he would because she's his wife. There's all sorts of things where if she was his wife, you would expect some kind of statement to that effect. But actually, to think of her as Jesus' wife, in a way, can also diminish her, I think, a little bit, because then her role as the foremost female disciple is airbrushed out, and it's all about her relationship with Jesus, a romantic relationship with Jesus. But it was more, she was also a leader. So I think that that is implied by her foremost position over and over again. As Helen said, whoever is first is you watch out for those sorts of indicators in terms of who is the leader, and she is almost invariably the leader of in terms of the other women. So that's her key role,
Thank
rather
you.
than her relationship with Jesus.
I think one of the best arguments against Jesus being married to Mary or anybody else is this expectation that the end of the world is going to come pretty soon. You know, in the first century Jewish context, marriage was for the bearing of children. I mean, that's the main reason you get married. And I think if you think the world is going to end, you don't get married.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosalind. So we have the Gospel of Dan Brown, who thinks. So just to let everyone know that we do on July 18th at 7, we'll have Joan back, and she's actually going to talk about some of the work that Helen and Joan have done together, but on Mary in the movies, Mary Magdalene in the movies. So we want to take a look at that more deeply, and we'll do that around the feast of Mary Magdalene. I did want to ask one question in terms of a little bit on the order of, so if Christians were sent out, the followers of Jesus were sent out 2 by 2, and we believe that some of those 2 by 2s included women, was there also a parallel in other sort of sectors of society where that would have been okay? We had a Jewish scholar not so long ago who really kind of made it sound like that couldn't have happened, but I was just curious what you thought in terms of the possibility of that being true based on your own research.
There is a context of women disciples of philosophers who were philosophers themselves. And there is also within Judaism a context in Alexandrian Judaism in which there's this group, the Therapeutai, where men and women are living together and studying scripture together and creating music together. They play beautiful music together and sing together. I think it's difficult because if you only accept something as historically true that has a parallel, then also we're in trouble. You've got to sometimes expect some things to be socially subversive and quite unusual. But if a brother and sister were traveling together in terms of pilgrimage, in terms of trade, that would have been acceptable in the ancient world. What do you think, Helen?
Well, I think that's a good reason why probably a lot of these early ones do seem to have been married. I mean, if they were married, then instantly you've got no problem with any of that. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it does seem to be written in a strange way that it doesn't obviously seem to be the wife. But yeah, I think maybe there was some scandal and maybe they just embraced it, you know. The Christian message was scandalous in some ways. You know, it's turning honor and shame on its head. It's proclaiming a new way to be in the empire. So maybe they did just embrace it sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we have to head out here because I'm going to turn this back over to Russ, but just to say myself, thank you so much. This was such a joy. You're so much fun to learn from too, which makes it so enjoyable. Like, you know, we know the scholar. I mean, I cried through Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza's book. I mean, I was, oh my God, every word I had to look at. It was so hard, so dense. But I just love, I mean, her work is phenomenal. I'm just kidding a little bit, but you know, it's so wonderful the way you have presented this and the ways that you have tried to make this more available. I really, really thank you for that. So I'm going to turn this back over to Russ and he's going to take us out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deb, and thank you again, Joan and Helen. This was just the perfect way to celebrate Holy Thursday.
Holy Thursday.
So to close out, I do have some prayers of petition that I thought we might pray together, and the response I will put into the chat for you is, wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. These are some petitions that I put together in 2020 for Holy Thursday. when churches were closed and we could not obviously do the foot washing. So this was a way to honor that. So let us pray. Wash us, O God, of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of exclusion, that our church may be a place where all share equally at your banquet table, knowing themselves to be wonderfully made in your divine image and likeness. We pray, wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. Wash us, O God, of nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and all forms and systems of prejudice and oppression, that our lands may be spaces of bountiful welcome, sanctuary, refuge, and opportunity. We pray, wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. Wash us, O God, of consumerism, materialism, wastefulness, and other habits and mentalities that exploit and desecrate our common home. That Mother Earth may thrive, feeding, sustaining, and providing for all creation, we pray. Wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. Wash us, O God, of ignorance, hardness of heart, self-doubt, and fear, and everything that keeps us from walking in solidarity with the poorest and most vulnerable among us. We pray, wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. Wash us, O God, of feelings of despair and helplessness, that we may reach out to one another in tender care and seek new and creative ways to be in communion and solidarity with each other. We pray, wash us, O God, and make us servants to one another. Pour out your abundant love over us, O God, like flowing water, that we may be refreshed in faith and hope. May those who have died bathe in the light of your eternal presence. Give those who are sick to drink deeply of your healing energy, and immerse all those who provide for our basic human needs in your protective care. We make these prayers and all the prayers we carry with us in Jesus' name, amen.